Hello and welcome to Research Radio, a podcast of the Economic and Political Weekly. I'm Johan, and today we have a special episode for you on the EPW review of urban affairs. We have with us Dr. Karen Coelho and Dr. Anant Maringanti from the editorial advisory group of the Review of Urban Affairs. Thank you, Dr. Maringanti and Dr. Coelho, for being on the show today. Both of you have been involved with the Review of Urban Affairs ever since it began 12 years ago. So I thought it would be interesting to hear from you how the RUA began and what was the motivation behind it.
So I thought if I can just start here because for me, I just remember back to 2010, I think it was, when Anant, Vinay Gidwani, and I were in Bangalore at the National Institute of Advanced Studies, NIAS, where Vinay was running a workshop on urban commons. And at that point, Anand mooted this idea with us about, starting this special review in EPW for urban studies. And of course, we quickly jumped on board. This was very exciting because at that point, there was really no journal for urban studies in India. I mean, there had been Sarai, which had been publishing the Sarai Reader for a little bit, but really at that point, there was no actual ongoing journal. And of course, we immediately invited Amitabh Bhaviskar to join us, and that was the first advisory board, the four of us. And it soon expanded when Ashima Sood and Partha Mukhopadhyay joined a few years later. And it has remained with that membership until last year when two members, Amitabh Bhaviskar and Vinay Kidwani, resigned, and two new ones, Ratula Kundu and Gopa Samantha, joined. But I think Anant would do better to tell us more about, the actual idea behind the review and how it was built up. So,
Mm, okay. So, Johan, I mean, one of the important things that I think held all of us together or brought all of us together is a very deep personal bond with EPW. A lot of it actually came out of just that. Uh,
Mhm.
for me personally, I remember first discovering EPW as a teenager when it was not actually the current issues that I was reading. I was actually reading the earlier issues of the 70s of the Calcutta Diary.
Mhm.
That's where I started reading EPW. And gradually, over a period of time, even if I didn't understand anything, I just loved reading EPW. And then as I went on to do my PhD at some point of time in my life, I came across a lot of people for whom being published in EPW was matter of honor. It didn't seem to be mattering so much in citation rankings, but it was a journal which influenced thinking in many ways. So so I was looking at EPW over the years, and I found that there was a review of political economy, there was a review of women's studies, there was a review of agriculture. There was no review of urban affairs, and that seemed odd for someone who uh, kind of spent a fair amount of his working life at a time when India was thinking of urbanization as a very important process. So mid 90s or so, you begin to see that every policymaker is thinking about the urbanization question, the cities as engines of growth, etc. As this begins to build up, it was very clear to us that there was a big gap and silence on the urban stuff. People did write about it, but it would get scattered all over the place. So the conversation that Karen is referring to in Bangalore was basically about trying to figure out how to um, bring together corral, in some sense, different ideas about how to think about the urban. So with that, we approached the then editor Ramanohar Reddy, and he said, "Look, sounds like an interesting idea, but I can't pull this off easily because we don't have a in-house capacity to deal with the urban. We know how to do the other thing, but we don't know how to do the urban." So we said that, look, that's something that we can help with. We basically put together team. And for us, it was like the existence of the Women's Studies review, which is done by a group of scholars with a shared agenda, was a good model. You have a group of people who have a shared agenda. You want to do some things together, and you work with a journal that you respect and value so much. That's what we did. So we basically offered to do that, and Ashima Sood was the insider to EPW at the editorial desk. So we basically coordinated with Ram Manohar Reddy as the editor and Ashma Sood as the editor inside EPW. And that's why we started putting together the issues. And then, over the next 10, 12 years, things have grown a lot and it's been through many different changes. But yeah, that's looking back, it really looks like a big thing that we have pulled off.
Yeah.
Always very
And
proud of it.
yeah. And actually, I would say that, it's that the RUA has taken its own shape. It has, sort of formed its own path in a way. And I would say that we, as the editorial collective, have more witnessed it evolving rather than actively shaping its evolution. So, we've sort of, it's not like we just stood by, but I think a lot of things it sort of, took on a momentum and a shape of its own. But I think there are a few things that we have tried to hold on to as operating principles. And one of those things actually that stands out for me, and I think that this issue of the RUA highlights, is that from its inception, the RUA has been a space where both senior urbanists and early career scholars can and seek to put out their work. So in that first issue that Anant sort of, that we sat together and thought through and produced, we deliberately pursued that mix. We really said, of if we're carrying 8 or 9 articles, then half of them should be from early career or junior scholars, and some of them should be from well-known writers. And subsequent issues have seen this maintained more organically in terms of the submissions that we have received. So in this current issue, of the 6 articles, we find 3 of them that are co-authored by early career scholars or PhD students with senior or more experienced scholars. So I think that, in that sense, it's always been that space where both
Yeah.
ends of the spectrum and everything in between can speak. So that's
Yeah.
been one really good thing about it. And I think, uh, Anant, is there something you want to say? Because I have another
No, no, I
point.
was just going to say, add that one of the things that we really thought was very important in that first issue was to to think about these two different groups of people writing in a very different way. So, for example, you may have a number of people who have very deep insights into the Indian urban, but may not be writing at all in any academic formats. So what we said is that look, it's really important to get them to write commentaries, perspective pieces, and that is not going to be held to the same kind of evaluation as you would evaluate a paper where the scholar has to establish that the scholar has done the necessary field work, has been through the rigor, and so on. I'm not going to ask someone who has been observing as an active participant the Indian urban for 40 years to show me evidence that he or she has done the necessary field work. That doesn't make any sense. That's what was valuable to us, that we bring together both kinds of people, and I think that it has kind of stayed with us all the way through.
And that's generally the character of the EPW, right? I mean, the EPW has been this place where all kinds of
Intergenerational.
voices, yeah, I mean, it's really been, it's not that every article is strictly and consciously academic. There's been various kinds of commentaries, various registers of scholarship, various, types of voices in there. And I think therefore, I think it was a very appropriate sort of place for the Review of Urban Affairs in that sense to come on. But I think One other thing I feel that, since I'm an editor for an international urban studies journal as well, I keep, of course, reflecting on the difference between the RUA and the Urban Studies Journal. And one of the things I think that, on reading the papers in this issue, that got flagged for me as a very important asset or aspect of having a domestic urban studies publishing space is this certain familiarity it gives you with the basic terrain, a certain sort of intimate understanding or a set of shared concepts and categories that then allows conversations to go deeper. It allows for finer points to be made without having to provide this basic explanation of context that you would need to provide for an international readership. So, for example, if you take the Jain and Gidwani article, where on community capital in the e-waste business of Selampur, they are speaking to a very specific, very contextual, and I think a very crucial body of scholarship on how caste constitutes capital. And even more, I think it's showing how community kinship and or caste networks have birthed and nurtured this thriving e-waste economies of Selampur. The authors are able to quickly evoke those ecologies and landscapes of the space before going to set up their argument. Because Selampur is a place like many others in Indian cities, like Bolakpur in Hyderabad that Anant has worked so much on, or Kodangiyur in Chennai, which most urbanists or even lay readers can recognize as part of their cities. But what the article then goes on to do is to reframe this place, Selampur, from a denigrated, stigmatized place, a toxic, squalid dump, to an achievement of vibrant and productive placemaking. So I think it's only a domestic conversation, a domestic urban studies journal that sort of allows you to do that. And I think very similarly, the work that Shreyashi Dasgupta's article in this issue on the waste landfill of, is it pronounced Dapa in Kolkata? Which I think presents it as a space that does not just generate livelihood for hundreds of pickers, but also allows these women to build for themselves a temporary universe of possibility and autonomy and solidarity in which they can move and they can dress more freely. And interestingly enough, they feel safer there than in their own homes. So I think this kind of reframing of a familiar but stigmatized place would be much harder to pull off in an international journal. So I think that's, I mean, just to highlight why it's so important to have this space of urban
Mhm,
conversation.
mhm.
Yeah.
That brings me to the question of the themes. Could you tell us a bit about the process behind how the themes of the RUA are usually selected? And also, have you noticed any thematic shifts in the themes that the RUA covers over the years? Because I feel that that could tell us also about the changes in the urban spaces in the country.
Anant, you want to start?
Yeah. So when we started the review of urban affairs, one of we made a set of rules for ourselves, right? Like
Hmm.
one of the things we thought was that we should have these people who can speak from experience and speak into the urban. You have the younger scholars who will speak from rigor that they will demonstrate.
Hmm.
But a few other things that we also thought of very consciously is that we should have practitioners involved in it, writing from practice.
Hmm.
That as editors, part of the responsibility that we were undertaking then was to work with younger scholars who may be hesitant, or even the senior scholars who may struggle with how to frame a particular set of issues. So, in through conversation, we will actually arrive at how to frame the paper to
Hmm.
be published. So many of the papers in the earlier issues were kind of commissioned. That is, we reached out to people through our networks,
Hmm.
and then we didn't want to close it off to people that we would reach through our personal networks. We also wanted to keep it open. So what we did was to think of the RUA as one thematic issue per year and one unthemed issue per year. So the thematized issue would then allow us to kind of take a deep dive into an issue that is of some concern for us at that point of time. And the unthemed one will uh, be an open receptacle into which anyone can contribute at that point of time, and we pick up things that might be very important for that particular moment or time or whatever.
Mhm, mhm,
That said, what happened with many of the unthemed issues is something that, we were talking, Karen and I were discussing this the other day, is that the writing on the urban is very often a response to a policy moment, right? Something is happening around in the country, politically, in policy wise, in communities, and so on. And your authors are responding to that, right? So when you pick up your PhD thesis, you're picking up something that is topical at that point of time, and you're trying to respond to something that is happening all around. Then that writing therefore belongs to a set of themes that are already there, out there in the world. And what I think happened is that even when we said that this is an unthemed issue, the world was suggesting the themes to us through the authors, and we just listened to it very carefully because we also felt that it's important for us to write introductions to both the unthemed and themed issues. And so we would listen very carefully to see what was emerging as an implicit set of issues, processes that are happening in the world that these authors are responding to. So when we think about these issues, we are actually thinking at the level of what are these authors responding to, right? So you take with the paper that Karen is talking about, the Selampur paper. That the question of caste is something that we actually do not know very well how to talk about, think about in our academic space, is something that we all know. We seem to be knowing how to think about caste in rural contexts, but the urban somehow eludes us. We don't know what to do with it there, even though we kind of sense that it is very, very violent. So if you look at the entire series of reviews of urban affairs, you will see that caste keeps popping up every now and then, through different papers, through different thematics, as something that needs to be articulated. So there are all these struggles to articulate the question of caste. You will see the question of commons as opposed to private appropriation of urban collective resources cropping up every now and then. You will see the question of agency of people who are being governed in the urban popping up as a theme, right? So
mhm.
look at it carefully, whether it is a themed issue or an unthemed issue. You will find these kinds of themes coming up all the time. And these are themes that are there on everybody's mind. They may think about it, they may articulate it very differently, but it's there.
Yeah. I wanted to say something about the importance actually of having an unthemed issue. I mean, one of the things, I mean, in a practical sense, the RUA being just one of only two or three urban studies publishing platforms in India, and the fact that we were only bringing out two issues a year, we felt it was really important to just be there for people to submit all kinds of work that they're doing. So there was an importance, as Anand points out, of defining themes and picking up and articulating an agenda that's important in urban studies. So we had this themed issue, and then we had this openness to say, submit, because we wanted to also just be a platform where people could send their work. So yeah, so with the themed issues, I think they were curated in a couple of different ways. Sometimes one or more of the editors would propose a theme and put it together and commission papers around it. And at other times, we had guest editors who would come in and say, hey, we have a bunch of papers around this. So, for example, Shubhra Gururani, who brought out an issue on agrarian urbanisms or agrarian frontiers of the urban. Um, and things like that. And we had uh, a number of issues that our own editors or the members of the editorial collective put together themes. Um, but as Anant also was pointing out, somehow the unthemed issues have also tended to achieve this unintended thematic convergence. And just to say a little bit more about that what he was talking about, it's sort of a uh, recently in a Ashima Sood and I, where we argue in a recent review of urban studies writings from India in Urban Studies Journal, we argued that the field of urban studies has been somewhat statist, if you could call it that, meaning that its
Mhm.
concerns and preoccupations have been consistently determined by state policies, state analyses, that is, state sort of framings that have come out, and state actions. So,
Mhm.
for the longest time, I think since even the 2000s, policy documents, mission statements, and official reports that appeared in the public domain became these agenda shaping interlocutory texts against which we wrote critically. All of the critical urban studies literature sort of were responses to these state documents. And I think it is exemplified by the fact that it is really after the JNNURM, tried to sort of reframe the whole nature of urbanism in India in the 2000s, that you really see a lot of you see the field really taking its place in the scholarship in India. That is, urban studies articles come out. And I think an example, for example, a very like concrete example of how this played out in the earlier RUAs was, I think, an issue in 2011 or 12, which had two or three pieces on resident welfare associations and the politics of civil society formations in Indian cities. And I think these captured a moment when urban associationism was a policy agenda following the rollout of things like the Bhagidari scheme in Delhi, the ALM scheme in Mumbai, and other sort of participatory platforms and discourses within the urban reforms agenda in India, as well as the community participation laws that were being passed to accompany the JNNURM package. I think these conversations from the early 2010s in the RUA still stand out, today, as having articulated a critique of the exclusionary caste class nature of property based associationism and the modes of participation that were associated with them. And I think the current issue also engages with the urban policy agenda, with policy shifts and their mechanics and implications, whether through an analysis of how social media platforms like WhatsApp shape the relations of waste management, as in Jennifer Spencer's article, or how street vending policies are reflected or not in city master plans, as in Arvind Uni's article on street vending, or how official state sponsored lake festivals become opportunities for marginalized communities to assert rights to the city, as in the article by Vidya Pogu and Jonah Lagada. So I think, but really the fact that three of the six articles in this issue deals with waste is largely circumstantial. It was certainly
Mhm.
not planned. Yet somehow we always found that the RUA, with or without active curation by us, sets agendas of inquiry or at least closely reflects prevailing agendas in terms of the themes it captures in urban studies.
I'd like to also ask about the issue of gender, because there are two papers in the current issue that talk specifically about women and about how they find agency in their respective circumstances, whether that is the male dominated world of municipal councillors or the dehumanizing realities of working as a waste picker in a landfill. Would you like to comment on that a bit?
Yeah, thanks, Johan. So I think both these papers deal with constrained or negotiated agency, but really in almost opposite ways. So
Hmm.
the Kamath and Rajadhyaksha paper on women corporators in Vasai Virat present this constrained agency in terms of political pragmatism and a feminized repertoire of public service that women corporators have built within a local body, as you say, dominated by real estate interests and a builder politician ethos. So
Hmm.
even as these women learn the ropes, they try to craft visibility for themselves as competitive and politically ambitious individuals. And since the majority, of course, as the authors point out, are from the dominant political party, their political personas, performances, perspectives are inevitably determined by those of the party with its agenda of urbanizing this part rural municipality but also by their caste and class affiliations. But by contrast, Shreyashi's Dasgupta's article, where she's writing about women pickers at the Dapa dump, describe a very different agenda within which women craft their agency. That context is an invisibility that is constituted in many different ways, physically, socially, structurally,
Mhm.
wherein those workers are undercounted, undocumented, neglected, peripheralized, and absent from national, state, or local solid waste management plans and policies. Now, how these women build agency within this complex of invisibility is by building and inhabiting a temporary liminal space of out of bodiness in which they not only suspend their sensory sensitivities of smell, sight, and touch to be able to handle the waste,
Mhm.
but also suspend their gender and sexual identities and the norms that govern those identities. So they occupy what she calls a third space in the middle of the trash,
Mhm.
which Dasgupta describes as, I'm going to quote from her here, a world of their own where they work, eat, dote on their children, and find support in each other, unquote. So this is a space where they dress as they please and they can shed the norms that subordinate them. Dasgupta offers this striking insight, which perhaps should not be so surprising, that women felt much safer on this hazardous dump yard than they did in their homes. So,
Mhm.
this really unlikely and abject space offers, however fleetingly and partially, the seeds of a feminist utopia in which women can find solidarity, safety, and autonomy while earning their livelihood. And I think that is, really the
Mhm.
sort of
Mhm.
the really stark difference between the two kinds of, a performance of politics on the one hand, and this kind of liminal place building in the middle of a trash dump where they basically have build an out of body place
Mhm.
to inhabit for a while. Yeah.
I was quite curious to see this paper on Vasai Virar because, growing up in Bombay, that region wouldn't really be described as urban, and to find mention of it then in the review of urban affairs was very interesting. I mean, it shows that the city has grown, and at the same time, there is still this fact that, Vasai Virar is an extension of Mumbai. So, my question then is, has the RUA and more broadly urban studies in India looked at urbanization beyond the big cities?
Go for it, Karen.
Um, I think this has been a very important agenda of the RUA right from the beginning. Is to sort of conceptualize the urban in different spaces. So not equate the urban with the city. Look at the peripheries. Try to think about margins of all kinds. To really ask what is the urban and what are its boundaries, margins, and constituents. And I think, definitely one entire thematic issue has been devoted to agrarian frontiers and peri-urban developments. A number of articles over the 12 years have talked about, uh, peri-urbanization, and have also looked at small towns and non-metropolitan developments. This has remained,
Mhm.
I think, an explicit and important focus of the RUA.
Mhm.
And I think the RUA has also remained consistently committed to making visible all manner of invisible and unacknowledged urbanisms, not just
Mhm.
the geographically peripheral, but also many intra urban peripheries and margins, of which garbage dumps or waste recycling districts of the city, street vendors, informal settlements, all of these are examples. These
Mhm.
aspects and operations of the city, which may be seen as the underbelly of India's new urbanisms of finance, infrastructure, connectivity, mobility. Uh, they may be seen as the underbelly, but the RUA really presents them as the beating heart, the core dynamics that make the urban possible and that
Mhm.
are more complex and sophisticated than is recognized. And I think the article on Selampur and on Dapa or on the lake festivals in this issue are great examples of this.
Johan, I think actually you touched on a very important issue, which is that what gets to claim to be the urban in India.
Mhm.
And for a long time, what gets to claim to be the urban in India was determined by uh, two things. One is what do the world think is urban, which means that where do your dominant metropolitan theory comes from. And the second is, how does the state, the government of India, or the state governments define the urban? Right? I mean, if you look at the technical definition of the urban, it's a pretty restrictive one, right? It's a demographic definition of what the urban is. You have to have more than 5,000 people, you have to have more than 400 people per square kilometer, and you have to have more than 75% of the male main workers outside of agriculture. Any two of these conditions met, you become a census definition urban. And then if the government agrees or if the people say it's okay, then you become a statutory urban, right? And I think that this way of thinking about the urban has been the dominant mode or dominant image of the urban, precisely because of what Karen was saying a while ago, right? About how a lot of our work as urban studies people was very statist, right? So you work with power, you look at the territory from the point of view of power that has the 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 resource, material, and other kinds of backing to regulate, to control, to shape, and so on, even if it actually completely, utterly fails to do so, right? Which is what master planning is about. That you imagine that you have the power to control and regulate things, and that's how you make the plan.
Mhm.
And then the city just kind of, in particularly in India, tells you that, look, I don't have to follow your plan. We have our own plans. So Vasai Virar actually has a plan of its own. It has a mind of its own, right? I mean, every place in our cities does that. Selampur has a mind of its own. It's a mind that is that kind of responds to a network of operators who are organized as guilds, in some way, who are able to take decisions, move resources, move labor, regulate labor, put in hours, take risk, all of this. That's how it works, right? None of which actually makes its way into the master plan,
Mhm.
right? The lens of the plan, the lens of the state, the optics of the state is incapable of even sensing what this is all about. And I think that review of urban affairs actually is something that came about in a very interesting way when there was a generation of people who were not in any technical sense really urban studies scholars. I mean, Karen Coelho is an anthropologist. I'm a geographer. Partha Mukhopadhyay is an economist. Vinay Gidwani is an economic geographer. Ashima Sood is a microeconomics person. We all came to this. Amita Bhaviskar is a sociologist. So we all came to this from very different backgrounds, having done many different things in many different places. And we came to this saying that, look, there is a particular urban imagination that we need to craft. And therefore, everything that we put together in this is actually a claim to say that this is urban.
Mhm.
So that is the diversity that you see in the review of urban affairs. You pull out a paper and say, why is this urban studies? The answer would be very, very interesting in each case, and the answer would not be actually the same for all of those papers.
Mhm.
Each of them claims to be the urban because of a very different reason. And that's what was the most exciting thing about it, right? Each time when we put this stuff together, each issue, each call was about trying to persuade people to imagine the urban in a new way.
Mhm. I'm glad you mentioned planning because that's my next question. Uh, I would like to hear about this encounter between urban planning and informality. In the current review, we have one paper which looks precisely at this issue by studying how street vendors feature in the master plans of Delhi. And then there's another one on how citizens' participation in waste management through WhatsApp, which, while being successful at increasing accountability and efficiency in the short term, also adds an element of informality since, for example, if there are any complaints, those complaints are not formally registered. Uh, Considering that informality seems to be the rule rather than the exception, Or, as Dr. Sood puts it in her introduction, that Indian cities so often seem like unworkable machines held together only by a dubious patchwork of jugaad. Do you think there is need for a different approach to planning in the Indian context?
So, yes, Indian planning does need um, to reimagine itself, but it's not going to be an easy thing to happen, right? Precisely
Mhm,
because it's so caught up with state practices. We do not yet have a situation where the state or the polity or communities are capable of living with um, planning as something which has a life of its own. But if you look at the history of planning in India, you will see that there have been attempts to move from the very strong state dominated approaches. So, for
mhm,
example, um, sometime in 2004, Hyderabad city came up with the Comprehensive City Development Plan, which then became a model for all the cities that were applying for JNNRM funding. All cities that were applying for JNRM had to have a comprehensive city development. Now, this comprehensive city development plan had actually no statutory standing at all. A master plan is a legal entity. It's an outcome of a legal process. It goes through the assembly. It's a process that is backed through and through by law. The comprehensive development plan was a convening of stakeholders in the city
mhm,
who then come up and say that, okay, we have a strategic vision for this city, and we need this strategic vision at this point of time because everything in the world around us is just constantly changing and shifting. And city leadership, political leadership, either at the state level or at the city level, needs to be able to operate with some kind of light footedness. I need to be able to work with some agility. And so I want the uh, key stakeholders to give me that authority to do that. And thus the CDP, the Comprehensive Development Plan, is basically a strategic document which gives you that kind of a mandate that this is what as a city we want to achieve, right? And no legal value. But we
mhm,
did produce those documents for every city. You will see that many cities now, increasingly in response to some funding scheme or the other of the central government, are coming up with plans which are smaller, which are local, which craft the urban in a very very different way,
mhm.
right? So the master plan is one of the ways in which we imagine our cities. There are many other things that have begun to happen. You have
Yeah, and I think
industrial
that
area local authorities, which are governed very differently from the municipal corporations. They kind of figure out what they want to do. Karen, I just let me just finish one last point, and then I'll cede to you. So I think what the papers that we are looking at, that is Arvind's paper and then Shreyas's paper, are looking at are actually two slightly different issues. Arvind's paper is basically talking about why master planning uh, response to informality in the city should be less about regulating and controlling and directing and more about social justice,
Mhm,
right? That is planning has always been done to regulate things and regulate things for what planners think is their mandate to produce a certain kind of well-being in the city, a certain kind of economic efficiency. What the street vendors question throws up is the need to insert other values, other mandates into the planning process.
mhm,
Yeah, that's one set of issues. The WhatsApp story from Shreyas is actually about how your government machinery has become so complicated, so complex that it doesn't even know how to respond to things. And that is when you actually have people using new technologies to be able to reach out without having to go through the known standard grievance redressal mechanisms,
Mhm.
right? So instead of having to go and file one appeal in triplicate to be handed over to some four different people, पेशी में डालो उसको stamp लगवाओ, right? Instead of all of that, I'm sending a WhatsApp message. You will see that a lot of policy decisions, program decisions, actual direct implementations on the ground are often taken by ministers via Twitter.
Mhm.
It's happening all the time, right? People say, we have this problem here, this needs to be settled, and the minister responds to it. So, tagging the minister, um, sending a WhatsApp forward to people, these have become important tactical moves for a lot of people, and people have become quite smart at doing that, right? So, I'm saying that there are two slightly different sets of issues that are being thrown up by these two different authors. And I think that both of them are very important debates. We should hold on to them. Just
Mhm.
conclude with one point about informality and planning. I think that we have a tendency um, to look at informality by and large as something that has to be gotten rid of, right? It's a relic of something of the past. It's a something bad. It's a deformity, and so on and so forth. And it comes from a certain kind of theoretical uh, training that we have had, some way in which our caste positions, our educational background have all trained us to. But there have also been a lot of attempts in the recent past. I mean, one of the projects that I was very closely involved in is called Tacit Urban Knowledge Network, which is basically saying that, look, informality is actually a very complex knowledge system in which a lot of formal elements of knowledge are actually deployed.
Mhm.
I mean, street vendor may look informal, but the guy has to handle some 15 different pieces of paper. A pan ki dukan has to get so many different permissions and licenses and so on and so forth to be able to operate. So they are deeply involved in formality, and yet they are informal. So this stark division between the formal and the informal is a ploy of power.
Mhm.
And I think it's really important for us. That's the first lesson for any planner to think through, is that the division is actually not so stark on the ground. People are
Mhm.
both formal and informal all the time. And when planners, when officials, when implementers recognize this and stop using the formal informal division as a tool of power, I think our cities will become a lot more humane, a lot kinder, and I think that that's what we all deserve. Right? Karen, sorry,
No, no,
I
I
just
think, no, it was just exactly, I think you've already made the point I wanted to, which was try to relate, by the way, Jennifer Spencer's article on the WhatsApp uh, platforms to informality. I think exactly as you pointed out, I think the technology of WhatsApp seems to be a way that both officials, that is, managers of the service, and the public are getting around all of the ways in which the formal rules tie people down and sort of tie governance up in knots. And I think platforms like this seem to be, a way around it, which is why they're so popular. And they basically are just a bypass to
Mhm.
all of these rules and regulations. And I think that their very popularity is a signal of how important it is to find these bypasses around. But I think what's also interesting is the way, yeah, I think in this article, uh, two kinds of users of WhatsApp are mapped out, right? There's the one kind that is about associations of residents who are using the platform to complain, and as a way to access services, a faster response, or accountability from the service. And these are residents of cooperative housing societies, etc. And then you have the other form in which the platform is used to monitor, surveil, and as a reporting mechanism for a lower class, low income settlement where the participants of the WhatsApp are workers or contracted to clean the trash. And so I think, again, you see, even in these bypass mechanisms, how it is structured by certain relations of the state with certain classes and castes and segments of people. And I think her article points that out very well, how a platform uh, like WhatsApp can also reflect the kinds of segments and relations that the state has with people. And also, I think what it does very well is to kind of illustrate the sort of range of exclusions, disconnections, and boundaries that a WhatsApp platform can create. Not least the sort of distance from the materialities of waste picking, etc., where you can, sit on your phone and manage waste in a very kind of abstract fashion. I thought that was a very insightful observation.
For my final question, I'd like to ask, because on this podcast we have the opportunity to talk about things that didn't make their way into the papers. I was wondering if there was any paper or theme that you would have liked to see discussed in the RUA or in future issues.
I think there's a lot of work out there that hasn't come necessarily to the RUA for various reasons. Among them, that we don't have, a lot of space. We have two issues a year. Recently, we have one, and so I think there's a lot of writing out there on the urban that has not necessarily found its way into the RUA. So that's one thing I will say as a caveat. But I think there's also a fair amount of work that has not been done inside India, perhaps done by Indian urban scholars, but in the academy outside of India.
Mhm,
So I think these are two large areas where I think quite a bit of work is happening that hasn't found its way into the pages of the RUA. One, I'm just going to flag a couple, and maybe Anant has a lot more to say on this. One area that I can think of that where I don't see much work happening within India, although some is beginning to emerge, is work on the non-human, more than human, multi-species urbanism, where I know there's some amount of work on stray dogs and other things, but I feel that that field is got enormous potential for analysis and to say something about the way we live the urban and the way we should live the urban, and
mhm,
we haven't looked at it enough. And the second, I think, would be perhaps I would call it an interrogation of urban futures. I mean, it could be both in simple terms, like youth aspirations. What do the young people of all stripes, of all castes, ethnicities, etc., see in the urban and hope for from the urban? But also to look at it in a more complex sort of social ecological terms. We haven't seen much engagement with Anthropocene concepts,
mhm,
and also more fundamental interrogation of the urban as a sort of planetary future, and what does this mean given the sort of situation we are in ecologically.
mhm,
I will jump in. I'm greedy. I'm very greedy always when it comes to what can be done, what can be talked about. Because one of the things that I have that I always enjoy and almost feel hungry for all the time is young people exploring new inquiries. Some of them struggle to find articulation. Some of them hesitate to bring it into the world of academic work because it's not easy to bring lived experience into the academic world and go through the challenges of that world. Right? Very complicated politics of knowledge production. But all that said, I think one area of work that we haven't done in RUA until now is the um, work that is there in bits and pieces in different places on sexuality in the city. We haven't seen much. And that could be from starting from the presence of transgender folks and the violence that some of those bodies experience, to the way in which intimate spaces are regulated, governed, etc. in our cities, all of that. Could have actually done um, more work on that in the review of urban affairs. The one thing that I would really love to see is work on health and medical stuff in the urban. The third that I would really love to see is urban employment. We see a lot of stuff on migration, but that migration work actually doesn't tell us enough about how individual households in these transitionary spaces, such as small towns, census towns, etc., where part of the family is still in agriculture and is deciding how to send one part of the family to the city into the cash economy, right? Earlier years, 20 years, 30 years ago, it would be that you are in agriculture for 6 months and then you go to the city to become part of the waged labor market and then you come back. Those kind of things have changed. But how do households take these decisions? What kind of jobs are available in the city, etc., is something which we really don't know much about. And I really, really love to see that work, because all of these things that I have just mentioned are themes that are going to, in some way, um, push against the traditional demographic approach to understanding the urban. Right, a third one, a fourth one that we kind of have seen bits of in the past, but I would really love to see more of on urban ecologies. Well, what Karen is referring to as the non-human. Um,
Mhm.
we really don't know enough about the different ways in which the biosphere or the geosphere operates in the urban. So I think it'll be really, really great to see, you know, future issues bringing those things together, collating them. It'll take a little bit of extra work, but we need to bring in people to those points, because the key thing to me is not so much that we can ever claim to have something authoritative to say about these things, but we need to learn how to speak about these things without feeling awkward.
Mhm.
Just one more, I guess, theme that popped into my head as Anant was talking is that we really don't have enough, in the pages of the RUA, or in fact other urban journals for that matter, on protest and struggle and dissent in the urban. And I think that uh, happily we have seen explosions of dissent on the streets of Indian cities lately, and we know that the urban is that theater of of protest and of struggle and of staging opposition to regimes and all of this. And we don't have any dearth of that kind of politics in the city. And I really, I'm actually somewhat surprised that there hasn't been more writing in that on that. Not just now, but actually even over the past decade or so. So that would be something. I mean, it's perhaps difficult to write about that in this, but um, worth doing.
Mhm. I think those are all my questions for today. Thank you, Dr. Maringanti and Dr. Coelho. It was a pleasure having you on our show today.
Thanks,
Thank you.
thanks, Johan. Thanks, yeah.
Thank you, Johan. Thank you, Karen. Bye.
I also want to thank all of our listeners for joining us. And there's a link in the show notes to the review of urban affairs where you can find all the papers published as part of RUA since 2011. And to experience all that EPW has to offer, head over to epw.in today and subscribe. This is Johan saying bye bye and see you next time on Research Radio.